without any further ado, please give a very warm and silent welcome to our Catherine Eubanks. So, Catherine, can you speak? Can you hear
Okay.
us? Okay, go
Yes,
ahead.
hear me. Okay, great. So first, thank you so much, Alex. Alex does such a tremendous job behind the scenes putting this together and holding my hand through using this technology. So I want to thank Alex for that. So today I'm going to be talking about the Rupture Resolution Rating System, or 3RS. And I know that I may have a diverse crowd of people here. There may be people participating who know the 3RS very well and have used it a lot, and there may be people who have never seen this before. So I'm going to try to appeal to both audiences. I'll do my best. So some of this will be sort of basic introduction, and then some of it will hopefully be somewhat helpful to people who are more experienced with the measure as well. So, and you can see there on my first slide, the manual, the sort of the current manual that we're using, and it's available on my ResearchGate page, and also if you email me, and I'll have that information in an upcoming slide. So just to give you a sense of what I'm hoping to do today, I first want to talk some about the measure in general and the aims of it when we created it, what we were hoping to do, review some basic terms that are important whenever we're talking about ruptures, talk some about the approach to coding that we encourage people to use when using this measure. We'll do an initial practice exercise where we'll identify some ruptures in a brief film clip. I have several breaks for questions, so if you have a question, we will have time to address those as we go along. Then we'll also review the specific rupture markers and resolution strategies and global codes in the 3RS. We'll practice coding a video clip of a patient and therapist. It's actually, I play the therapist and one of my students plays the patient. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about using the 3RS in research. So right off the bat, I have to acknowledge my collaborators, Chris Moran and Jeremy Safran, and everyone involved at the Brief Psychotherapy Research Program at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Medical Center in New York. This project obviously grows very much out of Safran and Moran's work and their theories and research on alliance ruptures and how to resolve them. And there I have at the bottom of this screen, I have the official site for the current version of the manual if you want to cite it in anything you're working on. So I just wanted to, right from the beginning, sort of introduce you to the actual coding sheet that we use for this measure. Don't worry about all the details at this point. I just wanted to highlight a few things. So we use this measure coding in 5-minute time bins. You could adapt it if you wanted to have shorter time bins, for example, for your particular data set. That would be totally fine. I wouldn't recommend going longer because I think if you allow too much time to elapse in the segments, then there'll be too much going on to really capture well in a code. But this is what we found works well for us. So you're coding every 5 minutes, sort of marking off what rupture markers and resolution strategies you've seen occurring in those 5-minute spots. And you're coding withdrawal markers. So it's one type of ruptures. We'll talk about that more, what those look like in a minute. Also looking for markers of confrontations, another category of ruptures. And then finally, the resolution strategies, which are what is the therapist doing in response to these ruptures. So once you've sort of checked off what's happened in a segment, and with my group, we just do checks. If this happened in the 5 minutes, we put a check. If something happened that we're not totally sure, like maybe that was a resolution strategy, or maybe that was just therapy as usual, or maybe that was a rupture, we're not completely sure, we like to use check minuses to capture those kinds of events. So you could choose to do that or just do with checks. At the end of the session, once you've gone through all the 5-minute segments, there are some sort of overall global codes. First of all, up here in the upper right-hand corner, it's hard to see, but it says SIGNIF, S-I-G-N-I-F, and that's short for significance, and that's trying to get at sort of the significance or clinical impact of what you coded. So for example, you would make one rating on a 1 to 5 Likert type scale of how clinically impactful all the denials were in that session, or all the minimal responses, or what have you. So you would do that for all of the different markers, go all the way down that column. And then there are 2 additional global questions that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay, so what was our aim with this measure initially? We wanted to create an observer-based measure of alliance ruptures and resolutions, but we really wanted it to be user-friendly. So from the beginning, we wanted it to not require transcription. You can certainly use transcripts, and I'm going to do that later in this webinar to sort of highlight why I'm coding certain things a certain way by being able to point to specific lines of the dialogue. But we didn't want that to be required because that adds such a burden to research teams to have to transcribe. So our aim is for this to be usable without needing transcription, just coding straight from the video. And we also wanted it to be something that graduate student coders could use reliably. So this means both, I'm not sure how good undergrads would be, or people with no exposure to therapy, no clinical training, no therapy experience at all. I'm not sure how well they would code. I can't say, I haven't tried it. I think having some clinical knowledge is helpful. But on the other hand, we didn't want it to require expert coders. We didn't want it to be something that was so complicated or required so much inference that you would really need very experienced clinicians to be able to use the system. So that sometimes means some trade-offs. It's not going to be perfectly precise. It's not going to be, it's probably not going to catch every single nuance, but the hope is that it sort of finds this happy middle ground that enables people to use this measure to code really large data sets with lots of videos. We aim for a moderate level of inference, so we try to stick to what we can observe, to behaviors we can see, remind ourselves that we can't read the minds of the individuals we're coding, but sometimes we do infer to some extent. So we're not sticking to just easily observable behaviors, because that would probably, we'd end up missing a lot of important clinical phenomena. But if we try to infer too much, I think it would be really hard to get reliability. So we sort of strive for a middle ground there. We're still, and we're still fairly early on in the process of developing, sort of really refining and validating this measure. So we're still exploring and learning, and we're going to definitely revise it at some point in the coming years. So if you are using it, if you have suggestions, if you have constructive criticisms, they're really welcome. I'm really want to keep making this measure better. And your input, especially if you have access to different kinds of samples than I do, could be really helpful. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have thoughts about ways to improve the measure. So let's just review a few basic terms. This is probably stuff a lot of you are familiar with. We're talking about alliance ruptures, so we have to just sort of establish what we mean by the alliance. So our work on the alliance has been greatly influenced by Ed Borden's conceptualization, where he talked about the alliance including an agreement on goals, collaboration on tasks, and the development of a bond. So that is very much in our minds when we're thinking about what a rupture in the alliance is, which is basically a problem in one or more of those areas. Many terms have been used in the literature to talk about problems in the alliance, things like challenges, misunderstanding events, impasses, alliance threats, markers of enactments. Building on Safran and Moran's work, we use the word rupture. I want to acknowledge from the beginning that rupture is not a perfect word to describe all the phenomena that we code with the 3RS. In English, rupture really connotes a major breakdown. Sounds like a major break or tear in a relationship. We're going to use this word very broadly to describe both major conflicts, obvious breakdowns in the working alliance, but also minor tensions that may even be things one or more that maybe the patient or the therapist are not completely aware of. So if you're coming into this sort of thinking we're coding ruptures that are these big dramatic events, we're also going to be talking about much more subtle minor tensions. So keep that in mind. We're going to use this word in a more broad sense. So types of ruptures. We found it helpful to think of ruptures in two broad categories, confrontation and withdrawal. And this comes a lot from some work by Heather Harper in the late 80s. A confrontation rupture is when the patient is moving against the therapist. This is usually easier to see. It can be things like complaining, saying negative things about the therapist, being hostile to the therapist, complaining about the treatment, refusing to engage in a therapeutic task. Then there are also withdrawal ruptures, which are usually more subtle. This is when the patient is moving away from the therapist. And this could be the patient going silent, the patient changing the topic, trying to get away from what they're talking about. It can also include the patient moving away by seeming to move toward the therapist, but in a way that's not really true to the patient's experience. So for example, a patient who's actually not happy with what is going on in therapy, but doesn't want to upset the therapist, and so the patient acts overly deferential. That would be another example of a withdrawal, because the patient is really moving away from a collaborative, from working collaboratively with the therapist. So really thinking about these two people, are they working together? Are they on the same page? Or are they moving away from each other? Or are they moving against each other? These are sort of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about ruptures. It's very important to note that, as I say on the slide, it takes two to tango. We do think about ruptures as a dyadic phenomenon, so the therapist is part of what is happening, but right now the 3RS doesn't really reflect that very well. So this is a limitation. We define ruptures on this measure in terms of patient behaviors, but it's not always patient behaviors that are driving a rupture. There's also therapist behaviors. And so something that we're thinking about for the future is the idea of adding therapist rupture markers. So I can talk about that more in a bit, but I just want to acknowledge up front that that is a limitation of the measure right now. I should also add that in our experience so far, it doesn't feel like we're missing a lot of rupture moments, because usually even if the therapist sort of gets the ball rolling, let's say by being overly hostile or critical, the patient usually then reacts with a rupture marker that we do have on the measure. So I don't think we're missing a lot of important moments in therapy, but the way we talk about them, it would probably be better if we were really talking more explicitly about what the therapist is doing to contribute to the rupture. So in addition to the rupture markers, the 3RS also has a section for resolution strategies. And this is where we're trying to capture the therapist's efforts to respond to ruptures. So we have a list of various strategies therapists may use to respond to a rupture. This list also is probably not perfectly exhaustive. So you may find, if you're coding maybe a different therapeutic approach than what we have experienced coding, maybe there are things therapists do in that approach that we don't have a good code for. Please let me know, because I think it would be really great if we could refine the list of strategies and make sure that it really captures all the different things therapists do to address ruptures. In addition, on the topic of the fact that it's a dyad, we don't have anything that we call patient resolution strategies. So patients can also contribute to the resolution of a rupture. We don't have patient resolution strategies on our coding form, though you may find that some of the rupture markers, that rupture behaviors of patients can actually be attempts to resolve a rupture. So for example, a patient may withdraw in an attempt to smooth over a problem with the therapist. It may not be the most effective resolution strategy, but it could be something a patient's trying to do to reduce or avoid conflict with the therapist. So I want to say a few things about the approach to coding, because it's really important to keep some things in mind before you sort of let loose and start looking for rupture markers everywhere. And if you miss this step, you could end up really overcoding, really coding lots of things that aren't ruptures, or sort of mislabeling things. So first of all, and I sort of alluded to this before, what we focus on when we code, again, as I said, we can't read people's minds. So we don't know what the patient's thinking and feeling inside. And we want to be very careful about assuming we know or trying to interpret that. We also don't know what the therapist is thinking and feeling, and we want to be careful about inferring that as well. Though there are some times, for example, with the resolution, with the confrontation marker of control pressure, I do tell my coders, if you feel the pressure, if you feel like if you were the therapist, you would feel the patient pressuring you or trying to control you, that can be a good sign that maybe control pressure is happening. So we do still sometimes sort of imagine what may be going on inside, but we want to be very careful about it and try to tie things as much as possible to observable behaviors. Our focus really, though, shouldn't be on what we imagine is happening internally for each of these people. It's really about what's happening between them. So really trying to keep our focus on this space between the two individuals. Are they coming together? Are they moving against each other? Are they moving apart? So try to keep that as our focus. In addition, it's very important in the coding process to start with the question, is there a rupture? That's the first question to ask when watching a video clip. Is there a problem with the tasks or goals? Are the patient and therapist, are they not working collaboratively? Are they not on the same page? Is there a problem with the bond? Is there tension? Is there a lack of trust? We start there, because if the answer to that is no, then you don't code. So even if you see things in that segment that could fit on a surface level, sort of fit the descriptions of some of the markers, if it's not a rupture, then we don't code. So start with, is there a rupture? Only if you've determined that there is a rupture, there's some problem in the working relationship between these two people, they're not collaborating on the work of therapy, then you move on to what category of rupture is it? Is it a confrontation, working against each other? Is it a withdrawal, moving away from each other? When trying, usually confrontation you can tell. With withdrawal, one tip for that is if you feel bored watching the video, that doesn't automatically mean it's a withdrawal, but that's a good sign you should consider whether it could be a withdrawal. Because when patients withdraw, it can often become rather boring because they're just not really engaged and they're not really actively present in the room. If you're finding it very hard to say whether it's a confrontation or withdrawal, sort of a confusing interaction, it may be that it has elements of both. And that can happen a lot. And so also think about, is this sort of a confrontation wrapped up in a withdrawal or something like that? And then after you determined there is a rupture, okay, I know what category it is, then you ask, how is the therapist responding to the rupture? Is the therapist using one of the resolution strategies on the 3RS? Some of the resolution strategies overlap with things therapists do all the time. So, for example, illustrate task. A therapist could illustrate a task because they're introducing a task and you have to sort of explain the task when you first introduce it. That's not a resolution strategy. It's only if they're responding to a rupture, like the patient saying, I don't want to do that task, I don't understand that task, it doesn't make any sense. If then the therapist explains the task, then they're using it as a resolution strategy. So that's important to keep in mind. So what I thought would be a good thing to do now, even though we've only very briefly sort of overviewed the measure in broad terms, is to go ahead and practice coding, but just thinking in terms of the very basic questions. So I'm going to show a clip in a second from a film. And as you watch the clip, I want you to think about, is there a rupture? If yes, is it marked by confrontation, they're moving against each other, withdrawal, they're moving away from each other, or both? And how is the therapist responding? If you already have experience using the 3RS, feel free to think about specific codes, and I'll share with you my specific codes afterward. But if you're not familiar with the 3RS, just think about those questions of, is there a rupture? Is it more confrontation or withdrawal? And just kind of observe how the therapist responds. And just to give you a little background on this clip, this is a patient talking about his concerns about going to his high school reunion because he feels he has nothing in common with his former classmates because they have normal lives, whereas he doesn't. He is an assassin. And now we're going to watch the film clip.
I'm conflicted. I mean, I don't know if I really want to go. It's in Detroit. You know, and I grew up there, but I just honestly don't know what I have in common with those people anymore. You know, or with anyone, really. I mean, they'll all have husbands and wives and children and houses and dogs, and, you know, they'll have made themselves a part of something, and they can talk about what they do, and what am I going to say? I killed the president of Paraguay with a fork. How have you been? I'm just thinking it'll be depressing. It'll be depressing. Shouldn't you be taking notes or something?
I'm not taking notes, Martin, because I'm not your doctor.
Please don't start with that stuff again.
Martin, I'm emotionally involved with you.
How are you emotionally involved with me?
I'm afraid of you.
You're afraid of me.
And that constitutes an emotional involvement, and it would be unethical for me to work with you under those circumstances.
Don't you think maybe you're just upset because I told you what I do for a living and you got upset and you're letting it interfere with our dynamic?
Whoa. Martin, you didn't tell me what you did for a living.
Yes, I did.
You didn't tell me what you did for a living for 4 sessions. Then you told me. And I said, I don't want to work with you. And yet you come back every week at the same time. That's a difficulty for me. On top of that, if you've committed a crime or if you're thinking about committing a crime, I have to tell the authorities.
I know the law, okay? But I don't want to be withholding. I'm very serious about this process. And I know where you live.
Oh, now see, that wasn't a nice thing to say. That wasn't designed to make me feel good. That's a kind of a not too subtle intimidation, and I get filled with anxiety when you talk about something like that.
Come on,
I mean, that's.
come on. I was just kidding, all right? The thought never crossed my mind.
You did think of it, Martin. You thought of it, and then you said it. And now I'm left with the aftermath of that, thinking I gotta be creative in a really interesting way now, or Martin's gonna blow my brains out. You're holding me hostage here. That's not right.
I just want to work, okay? There's some issues that I need to work on in my life. I've read your books, your bestsellers on the top 20.
They were both ghostwritten, Martin.
What? The Annihilation of Death?
Yeah.
Kill Who, A Warrior's Dilemma? I read it. It was New York Times top 20.
Well, I don't know what to say.
Well, what do you say to other patients, you know? I don't know. How does it work? Ask me how I'm feeling.
How do you feel?
I'm feeling uneasy, man.
Okay. So I hope everybody was able to see that and hear that okay. That was a clip from the movie Grosse Point Blank, and that was a scene with John Cusack and Alan Arkin. So was there a rupture? Yes, very much so. Was it marked by confrontation, withdrawal, or both? So let me start with what was most evident, which was there was a lot of confrontation in that clip. So for example, complaint therapist. So when the patient says things like, shouldn't you be taking notes or something? Or I told you what I do and you got upset and you're letting it interfere with our dynamic. He's expressing complaints and concerns about the therapist. Control pressure. I know where you live. He was definitely putting pressure on the therapist to work with him. Patient defends self. So for example, when the therapist said, you didn't tell me what you did for a living, and the patient says, yes, I did. Got very defensive. Now, I'm not totally done with talking about ruptures, but I want to first say a little bit more about how the therapist responded. So you can see from the beginning, the therapist tried to clarify misunderstanding. That's a 3RS resolution strategy, to clarify that he's not actually the patient's doctor. He also did a lot of disclosing his internal experience of the rupture. So talking about how the patient was making him feel fearful. He also provided a rationale as a resolution strategy, so trying to explain why he can't work with the patient because it would be unethical. Now, in addition to the very clear confrontation and the therapist's responses, there was also some withdrawal towards the end of the clip. So after the therapist disclosed his fear of the patient tried to sort of smooth things over and appease the therapist. So he said things like he denied actually wanting to or threatening to kill the therapist. Said, I was just kidding. The thought never crossed my mind. So this is a withdrawal marker by denying something that's very evident. And also some signs of being deferential. I just want to work. I've read your bestsellers. He's sort of trying to appease the therapist with those remarks. So I just wanted to pause briefly here to see if there are any questions about what I've mentioned so far or about how I was sort of coding that clip.
So our attendees can either raise their hands here on the dashboard, like we talked before, or they can actually write here on the questions tab something for Catherine. So let's just take a moment to see if someone wants to add something. I believe, Catherine, you were so clear that everyone has no questions.
It's either really good news or really bad news when there are no questions. So we'll keep going and see if some more emerge.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about, I've talked generally in general terms about withdrawal and confrontation and resolution, but let's talk about those specific codes and review those a little bit. So for withdrawal, the withdrawal markers in the 3RS, let me just briefly say what each of these is about. So denial, like the example in the clip, is the patient is withdrawing by denying a feeling state that is really evident, or denying the importance of something that's going on, or interpersonal relationships or events that are relevant to the therapy. So the patient's moving away by denying something, trying to sort of shut down discussion of something. Minimal response, the patient is giving minimal responses. So this could range from being silent when the therapist asks a question, let's say, or maybe giving a one-word response to what should have been an open-ended question that should have elicited more of a response. So again, the patient is sort of shutting down the process of therapy by not participating. Abstract communication is when the patient's avoiding the work of therapy by using really vague or abstract language. So this is, for example, a patient who intellectualizes a lot. This is how we capture that phenomenon. So the patient they may be making very global, vague statements. They may, instead of talking about their experience, maybe they talk about like people in general, society in general. Those are examples of abstract communication. Avoidant storytelling and shifting the topic. So the avoidant storytelling is when the patient tells a story that's in an effort to avoid the work of therapy by sort of going off on a tangent or moving away from the task at hand. It's important to note not all, and I guess I say this at the bottom of the slide, not all stories are avoidant. So it's not that anytime the patient tells a story you code this, but it's when the patient is telling the story in order to avoid. Or the function of the story is that it leads to avoidance of what the patient and therapist were working on. This category also includes topic shift, when the patient shifts the topic, sort of changes the topic in order to avoid something. We used to have these as separate codes, but we made them one code because we found that often patients would shift the topic by telling a story. It would sort of be one maneuver, so we put them together. Deferential is when the patient's withdrawing by being overly compliant, submitting to the therapist in a deferential manner. It may be an effort to avoid conflict with the therapist, but it's really functioning to hinder the patient being honest with the therapist about how they're really feeling about what's going on. The next code is content-affect split. So this is when the content of what the patient is saying is discrepant from their affect. So most commonly, you'll see this patient is talking about something that's really upsetting or distressing, and the patient's smiling or laughing. It's a way of sort of moving away from really honestly showing the therapist, like communicating to the therapist how they really feel. So it gets in the way of the therapist understanding how the patient feels, because they're sending these mixed messages. It may be a way the patient is trying not to, like maybe they're afraid they're going to cry, they don't want to cry, so it comes across as smiling while saying something distressing, but it makes it harder for the therapist to realize what's really going on. You can also see this sometimes in conjunction with a confrontation. So the patient says something critical to the therapist, but then they try to smile and soften it with smiles. Content affect split is one that you obviously have to have video in order to code. And I know that some people are interested in trying to use the 3RS when they only have audio. And I just don't know yet how much that matters, how much is lost when you don't have the video, but for certain, unless someone's very clearly maybe laughing while talking about something distressing and you could hear it, you'd probably miss a lot of content affect splits if you didn't have video. And then finally, self-criticism and or hopelessness. And what's very important about this code, again, is it's in the context of a rupture. So the patient is withdrawing by becoming so self-critical and hopeless, they're sort of shutting the therapist out. Like in the spirit of sort of, I'm such a mess, no one can help me, you can't help me, this therapy can't help me, there's no point because I'm so messed up. Something along those lines. A patient who comes in and freely shares with the therapist how critical they feel about themselves is actually, that's a sign of a good alliance. So just because a patient is talking about sort of sharing self-critical thoughts, let's say, that's not this marker. It's only if the self-criticism is along the lines of sort of, I'm giving up on you, the therapist, and the therapy because I'm such a mess. There's no way you can help me. There's no point in engaging. So just, I guess the bottom point is just reiterating that. You've got to always start with, is there a rupture? Because otherwise there are things that can happen in therapy that may actually be part of good process that you're labeling with these markers if you don't first focus on, is there a rupture? The confrontation markers are usually, as I said before, easier to spot. So basically the patient expressing complaints, concerns about the therapist, about the activities of therapy, things you're doing in the session, like doing a thought record together in the session, doing a 2-chair exercise in the session. Those are activities. Complaint, concern about the parameters of treatment. So this may be, especially in a research context, if they can only come for so many sessions and if they have to fill out questionnaires, complaints about those things would be parameters. Complaint, concern about progress. So feeling like this isn't helping, I'm not making progress. If they say this isn't helping because you are incompetent, that would be more complaint, concern about the therapist. Reject intervention is when the patient is sort of rejecting or dismissing what the therapist is trying to do. So if the patient, if the therapist says, you know, makes an interpretation and then the patient is like, no, that's ridiculous, that's not right at all, that's a reject intervention. Now note that if, for example, the therapist says, let's do this 2-chair exercise, and the patient says, that's a stupid exercise, that would count as a complaint, concern about activity. Patient defends self is when the patient's defending him or herself against what he or she perceives to be the therapist's criticism or judgment. So the therapist, it may be that the therapist is being critical, it may just be that the patient sort of assumes that, but if the patient is defending him or herself against the therapist, we give patient defend self. Sometimes patients seem very defensive, but it's actually, maybe patient's talking about her boyfriend, and she's getting very defensive, almost as if the boyfriend were in the room. It's not directed toward the therapist, but it's really, if it seems really strong and unusually strong, we would probably at least give that a check minus code, because it sort of suggests the fact that she's getting so defensive in the room with the therapist, even if the content is focused on the boyfriend, raises a lot of questions about maybe that there's also some defensiveness vis-a-vis the therapist. So in those cases, we would give a check minus to just sort of capture, there seems to be something going on here, but it's not explicitly clear. Control pressure is when the patient attempts to control the therapist or the therapy, the session, or the patient puts pressure on the therapist to fix the patient's problems quickly. So if you have a sense the patient's trying to push the therapist, trying to provoke the therapist, that would get this code. Okay. So in addition, there are some, oh wait, I'm just realizing that I didn't include all of the, oh no, they're coming later. Okay, I was saying, where are the resolution strategies? They're coming later. Okay, so the next is the global codes. So I just wanted to sort of explain these a little bit, and you'll see, hopefully you can see in the corner of your screen there. So this is where I'm talking about this significance rating that you make after you've coded all of the markers. So this rating is trying to get at how much impact did this have on the alliance using a 1 to 5 Likert type scale, ranging from no impact to high impact. We introduced this because we wanted to address the possibility that ruptures and resolution strategies could be frequent and minor or infrequent and very impactful. So just looking at sort of how many 5-minute segments did this show up may not really correspond with what's going to have an impact on, let's say, outcome. So we wanted a way to capture the significance. To date, with the stuff that my students and I have coded, we found that these significance ratings are highly correlated with the frequency, with how often things popped up in the 5-minute segments. So for our data, it hasn't seemed to add a lot, but I've talked with other research groups who are using this measure, and other people think that maybe it will be really important for maybe depending on the type of patient or the type of treatment. So we'll see. I'd be interested to know other people's experience using this. A couple of limitations with our significance ratings. One is for the markers, the significance of it, it's usually pretty clearly kind of a negative impact. When a significant rupture marker happens, it's pretty clear that it was negatively impacting the alliance, at least during the rupture. With resolution strategies, though, we don't specify whether it had a negative impact or a positive impact. So a therapist could use a resolution strategy, clarify misunderstanding, let's say, and if that worked well, maybe it had a huge positive impact on the alliance. Now things are going great. If it didn't work well, maybe it had disastrous results that still had a huge impact on the alliance. And our current scale doesn't allow you to differentiate between positive and negative impact. So that's something we want to think about for revising the measure in the future. Also, our anchors for our 1 to 5 scale are rather vague, and so we're still working on coming up with better descriptions to help people discriminate between what's a 1, what's a 2, what's a 3, etc. Okay. In addition to those significance ratings, there's 2 more global ratings that people make at the end of the session. To what degree were ruptures resolved over the course of the session? This is a very simple item modeled after the self-report items on the post-session questionnaire that is used at the Brief Psychotherapy Research Program at Beth Israel. And this is the only thing, as you'll see in a moment when I talk about the resolution strategies, this is really the only place on the form to mark whether resolution happened or whether resolution strategies were used successfully. So it's a very simple item, and that may need further refinement in the future. We also have a question about, did the therapist cause or exacerbate ruptures in the session, also rated on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. This is an initial effort to try to capture therapist contribution. If you are using the measure and if you're using this item, it'd be great if you also had coders describe how the therapist contributed. I would love to get more information about that. We're hoping to use that information eventually to develop therapist rupture markers. Just from my own coders using this, another thing we'll be thinking about for the future is whether we need to distinguish between therapists actively making things worse, for example, being hostile, and sort of passively making things worse. So, for example, something's happening and the therapist isn't doing anything about it. So the patient tells endless avoidant stories. Therapist never stops the patient, never redirects the patient, never comments on this. The therapist's passivity is contributing to the withdrawal increasing, but maybe that's different than a therapist who's actively hostile. We'll have to see if those phenomena have different relationships with outcome and if we need to distinguish between them more. So the resolution strategies that are on the 3RS. So first of all, there's clarify misunderstanding, which is just if there was a simple misunderstanding, the therapist simply clarifies it. They don't really try to explore the underlying significance of the misunderstanding. They don't get any deeper than that. It's just sort of, no, it's not this, it's this. You know, oh, I didn't say that, I said this. Just a very simple kind of clarification. Change task goal is when something's not working, and so the therapist changes the therapy task or changes the goal of therapy in response to the rupture. So they may change it in an effort to maybe a patient complained about the task, and so the therapist modifies the task to satisfy the patient, or maybe the patient's just not engaged in the task, and so the therapist changes the task in an effort to sort of engage a withdrawn patient. Illustrate task or provide a rationale is the next one. This is when something's not working and the therapist may explain the task better, or give a rationale for what the therapist is doing, in the hopes that if the patient better understands what's going on, then they'll be more willing to engage in it. Invite thoughts or feelings is now moving to more kind of exploratory types of interventions. Those initial strategies were sort of direct, immediate, just trying to get the therapy back on track kind of interventions. These strategies, these following ones, are a little bit more exploratory. So, for example, inviting thoughts and feelings. So the therapist invites the patient to share more of their thoughts and feelings about the therapist, about the therapy, about the rupture. So not just exploring thoughts and feelings in general, but specifically in the context of a rupture, encouraging the patient to share his or her thoughts and feelings. Acknowledge contribution is the therapist acknowledging how he or she has contributed to the rupture. Disclose internal experience is when the therapist shares his or her internal experience of the patient-therapist interaction. So this is, again, in the context of a rupture. So not every time a therapist self-discloses, for example, but when it's happening in the context of a rupture, like in the clip we saw where the therapist talked about how the patient was making him afraid right then and there in the room. That was actually a great example of disclosing internal experience. Linking the rupture to other ruptures between the patient and therapist. So this is when you observe, we've got this rupture going on between us right now. This is similar to other ruptures we've had. Like, here we go again. We're engaging in that power struggle again, or we're doing that dance again. That's an example of linking. If the link is to other relationships, so the thing that's happening between us is like what you were describing happened with you and your brother, for example. So that, for example, a lot of transference interpretations could probably fit into this kind of category. Validate defensive posture is when the therapist just validates the patient's position, validates the patient's resistance, sort of says, you know, what you're doing is understandable. They don't explore it, they don't challenge it, they just really validate it. Again, important to keep in mind, this is in the context of a rupture, so not every time a therapist validates will get this code. And then redirect is when the patient is moving away from the task of therapy and the therapist brings them back. So the most common example is that the patient starts telling an avoidant story and the therapist brings them back to what they were talking about, brings them back to the topic at hand, refocuses them on the present moment. So that one, actually, that last one is not so exploratory. I probably should have moved it up higher in the list. Okay. So, like I said, really important that it has to occur in the context of a rupture. So, for example, if the therapist changes the task in therapy because the next item on the agenda is a different task, that's just what you would do next in therapy, then that's just therapy as usual. That's not a resolution strategy. If it's in the context of a rupture where the patient said she hates the task and the therapist changes the task in an attempt to keep the patient engaged in therapy, that's a resolution strategy. The way we've structured the 3RS is that we're coding whether the therapist tried these things, whether they used these strategies. We're not coding whether they succeeded, really. We do have that global code, as I mentioned earlier, about how much the ruptures were resolved across the board. But at present, we don't rate how successful a particular resolution strategy was. Our rationale for that was a couple of things. One, it's often hard to tell immediately if something was successful. It can take a while. And we certainly were worried about trying to do that within 5 minutes. Therapist does something, I don't know that you would see all the results of that in 5 minutes. We were also concerned that it might be too difficult for graduate student coders to assess and assess reliably if a particular strategy was successful. But we are open to thinking about changing that in the future. I know that there are studies where people really want to know if something worked and to be able to code how successful something was. So we are thinking about what would it take, how feasible would it be to add something where you're not just rating that the strategy happened, but also rating how well it was done or how well it was received. I guess there's like a lot of things we'll have to think through to define that in a clear enough way that people can use it reliably. So I wanted to take another break to see if there are any questions at this point.
So again, I'm going to suggest people can use the questions tab here, and also they can raise their hands. I believe we already have a question here, Catherine.
Great.
And the question is, if a therapist references and attempts to resolve a rupture that happened earlier in the session or in a previous session, does that get coded?
Yes, I would code that. And so, for example, like everything doesn't have to happen in the same 5 minutes. Absolutely. Now, I guess maybe the tricky part would be if what happens is the therapist simply refers to it, sort of like last week when you said this and you were really upset, and then they use a resolution strategy, I would probably just code the resolution strategy there because the actual rupture happened before. But if anything happens in the therapist sort of alluding to it, if it happens again, or sort of the patient is like, yeah, that's right, I was really mad at you, then you could also code the rupture marker again. But yeah, definitely that can happen. Some of my students coded a case where a rupture happened in like about session 10 or 11, and that patient and therapist kept talking about that rupture throughout the rest of the treatment. They kept referring back to it. So they sort of kept working on resolution. Obviously, another issue that this raises, just to be mindful of, is depending on your study, if you're coding many sessions from a case, you'll know when that's happening. Like you'll be able to recognize, oh, this is referring to that rupture 3 sessions ago. If you're doing a study where you're only coding 1 session per case, for example, you may not pick up on that. You just may not, there may be no way you could know what they were referring to or how that is actually a resolution. So that's just something to be aware of, that will affect your results too.
Thank you, Adelia. Actually, Adelia has left us another question here for you, Catherine. Regarding content affect split, what happens if a patient presents with no affect and it's unclear whether it's personality, pathology, or a rupture?
That's a good question. So if they're presenting with no affect and it's really discrepant with the content of what they're talking about, they're flat when talking about events that should be eliciting affect, I would code content affect split. In terms of, so a couple of things. I would code that it's happening. You could decide at the end of the session that it happened, but it didn't really impact anything. So you could say that it was very frequent, but did not have much significance, did not have much clinical impact. So you could give it a low significance rating to sort of capture that. The question of how do you know when it's a rupture and how do you know when it's personality or something else, that comes up a lot. And my answer to that is we can never know for sure what's causing anything. And what I've observed is people usually bring up this question around withdrawal ruptures. They're usually concerned that the patient's not really withdrawing, it's just, those are their defense mechanisms, or that's their psychopathology, or that's their personality. What I think is interesting is nobody ever says that about confrontation ruptures, which could similarly also be driven by personality, psychopathology, other things that are maybe internal to the patient and not necessarily about the dyad, right? So there could be patients who go around telling everybody, I hate you and this is awful, not just to their therapist. It really could be all about the patient. But we tend to be comfortable calling that a rupture, even when it's not necessarily, even when it's more sort of driven by the patient's own internal dynamics or what have you. So I think rather than trying to, since we can't read minds and we can't be sure, I focus on what's going on between these two folks. If whatever is going on is impeding their ability to work together, it's hurting the alliance, and I'm going to code it. That's sort of how I approach it.
Thank you, Catherine. We have another question here by Kane, asking if an event occurs between two segments. For example, a patient tells a 30-second avoidance story 5 seconds before the 5-minute mark. Is this marked as two events?
If it crosses two segments, I would code it in both segments. I realize that that's not going to be perfect because, a story that's 30 seconds long, depending on where it falls, right? It could end up getting 2-segment ratings or just one segment rating. But that's just sort of what we've done. And it's also in the spirit of kind of trying to keep this user friendly and being able to code a lot of videos. We just sort of have to make a decision. And so that's how we've handled it.
Another question here. Would you recommend watching a session first and then going back to code, or doing it all at once?
That is a really good question. And I think for me, I would recommend coding it all at once. I would recommend feeling free to pause as often as you need to. So, and feel free after a 5-minute segment if you want to rewatch that 5-minute segment. Absolutely. But I think the danger of watching the tape all the way through and then going back to code is if you know how it ended, it'll color how you see the beginning. And I just worry about that sort of biasing what we see as we go along. And also, pragmatically, if you have to watch everything twice, it'll just make your coding take a really long time.
So does anyone else want to ask a question to Catherine? I think for now we're good to go, Catherine.
Okay, great. So let's do another video. So I'm going to have Alex here play a video in a second. This is, I'm playing the therapist and one of my students is playing the patient. And again, if you know the 3RS, please feel free to code. If you don't, just try to pay attention to, is there a rupture or ruptures? Are they more marked by withdrawal, by confrontation, by both? And how is the therapist responding? And then we'll talk about the codes that I saw when I saw this video.
Okay, let me just do some internet magic here.
So I just was thinking this week about, it's just so shitty that you're leaving right now. I just have so many things going on in my life, and it's just like, I don't know, anyway. So internship is just, I'm so nervous to start it, and I just feel like I don't really know what to expect, and it's just making me really nervous and anxious.
So, Rachel, I do want to get to talking about internship, because it's really important, but you said something, I think, really important a second ago.
Yeah.
About me leaving.
Right. Well, it just sucks that you're leaving because of my internship, which is just like, I keep asking them what I can expect for next year, and they won't tell me, and so it's just so stressful. And I just feel like everything in my life is building up right now, and my anxiety's gotten more because of it.
It is a lot, and I think actually, given that we don't have a lot of time left to work together, I do think it's important for us to really talk about what me leaving and this new internship, what it all means. I think it is worth kind of slowing down a little bit, maybe to talk about that, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I just don't even really want to think about it.
Yeah. So what are you feeling now as you're trying to?
I'm mad. Why do you have to leave now? I'll be going through all these things. It feels like you're not even taking into consideration, our time together and what it's going to be for me without you. It's just sort of even another month, frankly, would have been better. If you could have considered staying for one more month. This is the worst time for you to possibly be leaving me. It's just you don't even care at all. What was the whole therapy anyway? So anyway, I guess I'll just find a different therapist.
You're feeling really angry at me right now. I can hear that.
Yeah.
You feel really hurt.
Yeah, I am. I'm really hurt. It just makes me feel did you not care this whole time about our therapy? If you're just going to leave and not even consider, what's going on for me. And, I know, you need to get more training, and like that's important too, and like I don't know, it makes me feel like if you need all this training now, like maybe you weren't even so helpful to me this whole time, if the training's that important.
So it feels like I'm saying these other things are more important than you, more important than our work together.
Yeah, that's how it feels. It's just like such ironic, horrible timing, basically.
You're right. You're absolutely right about that. I know it is terrible timing. We were like really making some good progress, and now you're going through this big change. And the last thing in the world you need is for something else in your life to get disrupted. It probably feels like I was pulling the rug out from under you when I told you.
Yeah, I think that is really exactly how it felt. It's just like right when I needed so much help, it's like I'm losing my main support, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it just makes me really sad.
Okay. So let me show you the codes that I had for that video, and then I'll go through kind of line by line and talk about where I saw these things. So in terms of withdrawal, there was shifting the topic. In terms of confrontation, complaints and concerns about the therapist, and complaints and concerns about the parameters of therapy. And in terms of resolution strategies, there was illustrate task rationale, invite thoughts, feelings, acknowledge contribution, and validate defensive posture. So let's look at the transcript. So the patient starts out with a very clear confrontation, complaint about the therapist, like she's really upset at the therapist for leaving. But then she does a topic shift, right? She just switches over to talking about internship. The therapist picks up on this and invites the patient to explore how she feels about the therapist and their relationship. She invites thoughts and feelings around that. The patient sort of repeats. So she starts out with the complaint about the therapist, but then again, she shifts topic and moves away from it. The therapist gives a rationale for why she wants to focus on the relationship. We don't have a lot of time left, so this is why I think it's really important for us to talk about this. But the therapist is also validating how hard this is and sort of validating why it makes sense that the patient's having difficulty with this. The patient acknowledges that she doesn't really want to think about it, and the therapist invites her to say more about how she's feeling. The patient really elaborates then on her complaint about the therapist, how hurt she is. She's also addressing the parameters of therapy. So you can imagine this is a therapist in a training clinic or a training setting where they're going to have to end treatment when their training is done. So it's really sort of a parameter of the treatment that the patient is expressing concerns about, that she's upset about. So the therapist then sort of is reflecting back what the patient says and what she feels. And these aren't super strong examples of validation and inviting thoughts and feelings, but in the context of the entire clip, I would definitely code them. But so what you can see here is it's more like the sort of the tone here that's validating. So if this were it all by itself, it wouldn't be a great example. But the therapist is doing this in a validating way and doing it in a way that functions to encourage the patient to keep talking. So the therapist is sort of encouraging the patient to keep expressing her thoughts and feelings. It would be a clearer example if validate if the therapist says something like, really, it makes sense that you are so hurt. That is real. I really understand why you're so hurt. And it'd be a clearer example of invite thoughts, feelings if the therapist said, tell me more about that. Okay. And then the patient shares more complaints about therapists, and then the therapist does an acknowledged contribution. So saying that, you're right, like you probably felt like I was pulling the rug out from under you. I really did do something that would explain why you feel so hurt. And this is also still validating, like your concerns are really legitimate and valid. And then these resolution strategies have, in this clip, sort of worked. So the patient is, at the end, no longer confrontational. She's really gotten into contact with feelings of vulnerability. And so that's a pretty successful resolution. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to use the 3RS in research, and then we'll have time at the end for any remaining questions. So definitely creative ideas are welcome. So I think there's a lot of things we can do with this data that I haven't had a chance to do yet, and I really welcome ideas or new ways of analyzing it or thinking about it. Tully Boritz and Ryan Barnhart and colleagues had a really, I thought, creative way of analyzing the data. They sort of were able to kind of weight the frequency ratings by the clinical significance ratings in a creative way. And that study is in press. It hasn't come out yet, but it will be appearing in the Journal of Personality Disorders. And that's a nice example, I think, of a creative way to use the 3RS data. Some ideas that my group is working on, we could simply use those clinical impact significance ratings. They're easy to use because you have one rating for each type of marker in the session. So you can end up with one session rating for overall withdrawal or overall confrontation, or you could go to specific confrontation resolution strategies if you want to really know about the relationship between abstract communication and outcome in therapy or something. You could focus on that significance rating. Or you could use the frequency ratings. And so what we've done is sort of a weighted frequency where for each 5-minute segment, everything that's a check. So let's say in that 5 minutes, there was denial and there was complaint therapist. Then if they got checks for both of those, you could say that, well, that was 1 for withdrawal and 1 for confrontation. If there was a check minus, then we would give that half a point. So it's sort of, the checks get more weight. You could add up how much withdrawal was there in that segment, how much confrontation was there in that segment, how much use of resolution strategies was there in that segment. And so you could use those scores either by segment, or you could average them or sum them across the session, and then relate that to other variables, outcome, other process measures. And I'm sure there's many other ways to go. We haven't yet really gotten into, another thing I want to look at more is really using the fact that we have ratings every 5 minutes and really using analyses that take advantage of that to really see, what is likely to occur in conjunction with or preceding or following what. So I think there's a lot of room to do interesting things there. Some findings we have to date, this is from a manuscript in preparation, where we coded 46 cases. We coded 1 session from each case, session 6. These were all CBT cases. The sample consisted of drops and completers. We were interested in comparing patients who, after session 6, at some point after session 6, dropped out, and patients who completed the therapy. This was a 30-session treatment protocol. So we wanted to see, can coders identify things that are happening fairly early on in treatment that could be sort of warning signs that somebody's going to drop. If coders could pick up on something that differentiated drops from completers, that is really interesting implications, for example, for training. I mean, if therapists could be trained to identify those variables early, they would have an opportunity to maybe intervene and prevent the patient from dropping out prematurely. So with this data set, we got good inter-rater reliability on the weighted frequency. We were initially just going to use overall withdrawal, overall confrontation, and we actually found that we were reliable even on the individual markers. So even on complaint therapist, complaint parameter, abstract communication, all those individual markers actually were reliable, which was exciting. So we had the ability to also analyze those. We also had good reliability on the clinical impact ratings, those things in that significance column. But at least with this sample, we found that they were very highly correlated, like 0.8, 0.9, with the weighted frequency ratings. So we decided to just focus on the weighted frequency. But like I said, there may be cases, other samples where those two numbers are different, and it would be important to include both. So in this data set, we did find more frequent confrontation markers in the drop cases than the completer cases. So this was exciting. So we did see more signs of confrontation in cases that dropped. We did not find a difference on withdrawal markers. But I do have colleagues in other places who have found interesting relationships between withdrawal and outcomes. So I do think I'm still rooting for withdrawal. I think withdrawal is a really interesting phenomenon. So I think it may depend on the data set or how one analyzes it. When we looked at that overall rating of how much did the therapist contribute to the ruptures, that's one of the global ratings, we found that therapists of drop cases were rated as contributing more to ruptures than therapists of completer cases. And in looking at that overall rating of how much ruptures were resolved in the session, we found greater rupture resolution in completer cases than drop cases. And obviously the raters, the coders were blind to who was a completer and who was a drop. So I thought this was good news, that they were able to identify some things that distinguish these cases that went on to drop. We have a whole bunch more data that we've coded and that we're still analyzing, so hopefully we can replicate this or extend these findings with more data sets, including data sets with not just CBT, but also our brief relational treatment condition. And a number of research groups are using the 3RS, and several of them are actually going to be part of a panel that we're doing at SPR in Amsterdam. And I'm also trying to put together a panel of some different things with the 3RS for CEPI, the CEPI conference in New York. So I do encourage everybody to come to those conferences if you can, because there'll be a lot more information there. And I just wanted to say something about, I think, some of the interesting research questions that the 3RS could maybe help us answer. So certainly, you know, it's sort of striking that there's so much agreement now in the field that obviously the alliance is incredibly important. It's a robust predictor of outcome. If the alliance is important, then obviously problems in the alliance are important. And so we all agree on that, but there's very little about what exactly, how frequent are those problems, what do those problems look like, how would you describe them? So I think the 3RS could be a really useful tool for trying to just simply identify what types of ruptures are most common, for example. Does it vary by patient diagnosis or other characteristics of the patient? Does it vary by characteristics of the therapist? Does it depend on the type of treatment? Or do you have certain kinds of ruptures that show up more in CBT and certain kinds that show up more in dynamic therapy or emotion-focused therapy, for example? Or maybe setting, or kinds of ruptures that trainees experience versus kinds of ruptures that experienced therapists encounter. Having more information about these things could be really helpful. If you knew going into a therapy that with this kind of patient, this kind of therapist, and this kind of treatment, this kind of setting, you're likely to see a lot of this kind of rupture, you could sort of prepare yourself to anticipate those and be ready to approach those. And just be more aware that they're likely to happen. It's hard to resolve a rupture that you don't realize is happening. So therapist awareness is really critical, I think. So this could be helpful in helping prepare therapists. What kinds of resolution strategies are most common? Does our list capture everything? Do we need to have more? Do resolution strategies vary? Do certain kinds of ruptures pull for certain kinds of resolution strategies or certain kinds of patients? Do therapists have their favorite go-to strategies? Which combinations of ruptures and resolution strategies work best? Are there certain strategies that are going to be most effective for certain kinds of ruptures or certain kinds of ruptures happening in a certain context? Whenever a treatment does not work as expected, I'm always wondering, could there be alliance ruptures and could that explain the outcome? So I think any time if anybody has video of any kind of therapy and you want to better understand why the findings were what they were, it could be really helpful to go in and code whether there were alliance ruptures and how therapists responded to them. An advantage of an observer-based measure for this is if maybe it was something you weren't thinking about when you designed the study, and so you did not include, for example, self-report alliance measures, but if you have videotape, we can always go back in and use something like 3RS to code for alliance ruptures and how they were resolved. This is a good tool for actually assessing the success of training, specifically alliance-focused training. So this is something we're interested in doing in our research group. We try in our alliance-focused training and supervision to help therapists recognize ruptures better and respond to them better, using this measure, we could actually assess if that is really occurring, comparing therapists who've gotten training to those who haven't, or the same therapist before receiving training and after receiving training. Does it really change what they do, and does it change what they do in the way we would hope and predict? And then another research possibility that I think is interesting is, can the 3RS itself be a training tool? Using the 3RS, sort of teaching therapists these markers and categories, would that help them in their own therapy recognize when a rupture is occurring and be able to be more responsive? Anecdotally, my own coders say that this does impact their therapy that they do, that they have these codes in mind, and they'll tell me things that came up in their therapy session, and they recognize, oh, that was control pressure or whatever. So I think that's also an interesting potential future direction for the 3RS, is to actually use it as part of training. So I want to open it up for remaining questions, and I have up here my email, the link to my ResearchGate page, and also the link to the Center for Alliance Focused Training website. And on these pages, the Center for the therapeuticalliance.org one, later today we're going to post the video that we worked on in this webinar today, and there are other videos there as well that you could use for practicing 3RS coding. And I'm going to be posting some more codes for those videos, as well as some other videos that are sort of available in the public domain, so that you could use them if you're trying to train yourself or a group of coders to be reliable on the 3RS. So let me open it up for questions.
Thank you, Catherine, for this wonderful presentation. And I'm gonna encourage everyone to write us a question here for Catherine. You have the questions tab here on the screen. We already have one question here, Catherine, which is, any empirical or anecdotal findings that differentiate between treatment modalities?
Oh, that's a good question. So my students two of my students coded a bunch of sessions, some of which were CBT and some of which were brief relational. And honestly, off the top of my head, I can't remember empirically what they found as to differences between those orientations. I mean, anecdotally, I would say certainly some of the resolution strategies sound more CBT-ish and some sound more dynamic. So for example, illustrating the task, providing a rationale, is something that could fit well in a CBT context where you're using a lot of tasks, and really explaining them well and being responsive to when the patient doesn't understand them, I think would be very important. And inviting thoughts, feelings might be, and also like the linking rupture to other relationships might be a good fit or more familiar to somebody with psychodynamic training. But I do think we need, this is something I want to do more research on, and I'm really interested in and excited about the possibility of seeing which of these are more common in different treatments, and also are different ruptures more common in different treatments.
James McDonald writes you, thank you, Catherine. How do you train coders, and how long does it typically take to get reliability?
That is a great question. Hi, James. So I would say it takes at least, I would say maybe like 20 hours of training. So think of that as maybe having 10 two-hour meetings, and maybe doing coding in the meetings together as a group, as well as having them do some coding on their own and then coming back as a group to discuss it. What I do is I do start out with some didactic kind of stuff, like what we did in the webinar today, and then we get into coding. And I might introduce the coding sort of one piece at a time. So maybe first, let's practice just coding the rupture markers and not worry about the resolution strategies. And then once people have a handle on rupture markers, add in the resolution strategies, and then add in the sort of the global codes. Coding together as a group and discussing, I think, is really helpful. And I would probably start with clips, shorter things, and then move on to full sessions. And it would be important to be coding something similar to what you actually need to code for your final project. So if your final project is going to be a certain type of therapy, I would want to make sure that you're practicing, at least maybe initially you could watch some clips from different approaches, but you would want to move to your particular approach, because there may be something about that particular kind of therapy that you all sort of need to get on the same page about how you're going to handle when certain things happen, what code is going to fit that.
And 2 more questions here. Delia asks, can one statement be coded with more than one marker?
So yes and no. Yes, if it really is that 2 things are happening in that statement. So no, if it's like you just can't decide. And so you just give it both because you can't make up your mind. So for example, if you can't decide whether something is a complaint about the therapist or a reject intervention, then I would say try to think through which it is. And only give it both codes if you truly believe that in the same statement they're both complaining about the therapist and rejecting the intervention. So for example, if somebody said, you know, you're a lousy therapist and your interpretations are stupid, you could give them both because they did both in the same sentence. Another one where it's really important to capture both is if they're doing confrontation and withdrawal at the same time. I think that would be really important. I'm less worried about the different subtypes of confrontation or the different subtypes of withdrawal, because I feel like, you know, even if you say it's complaint activity and somebody else says it's complaint progress, you're still very much in the same ballpark, especially if you've got a lot of tapes and you're aggregating a lot of data. But if you miss the confrontation and withdrawal combo, that feels like you're missing more of the phenomenon to me. So definitely somebody could be, you know, saying something that's critical but also has a piece of deference in it, let's say, and you'd want to capture that. It's like it's a complaint and it's deferential and appeasing sort of at the same time. I think that seems to me anecdotally, clinically important.
So James McDonald is saying really useful thank you to your previous answer. And Tony Romanier here says, thanks for the great webinar, Catherine. Are you or any of your students working on measuring therapist withdrawals or other rupture-related therapist behaviors?
So we very much want to. And so what we're doing right now is, so we've been making that overall rating of just how much the therapist contributed to the rupture on a 1 to 5 scale. And my goal is, the next project is to take all those examples of high ratings and go and look at them more closely and start working toward identifying rupture markers. You know, does therapist withdrawal, can we describe it the same way we describe patient withdrawal? Do we need to describe it differently? Same for therapist confrontation. Is there some other category that would make sense for therapists? I very much want to do that. And so what I'm trying to do is, we sort of now have a set of cases that have been flagged as high therapist contribution, and I want to use those to help us come up with more specific markers that then hopefully eventually we could add to the 3RS, or depending on how much of a burden it is on coders, whether it would make sense to add it to the 3RS or to be sort of a companion measure, I don't know. But yeah, I'm very interested in working on that.
Holly Hall writes, thank you, a very helpful session. What are your thoughts on using this measure with adolescents age 13 to 18 years of age in individual treatment?
So I'm very interested. I think that would be a great direction to go in. And I think my colleague Chris Moran has a student who's very interested in doing that. And I think it could be done. I think there may be modifications that need to be made, maybe. I think older adolescents, it might fit better. Younger adolescents, I don't know if we might need to refine the markers or add a marker. I should say, actually, whenever you're adapting this to any population, I think it's quite possible there will be markers you might need to add. So some of my colleagues, like Tali Boritz's team, are using the 3RS with cases of patients with borderline personality disorder being treated in DBT, and they've seen some types of ruptures that they feel like aren't captured perfectly by the 3RS code, so they're experimenting with a new code that they've created. And I think the same could happen with extending to, say, adolescents. Maybe there are things adolescents do in a rupture that adults generally don't do. Maybe it needs its own code, or maybe it could just be sort of an addition to one of the existing codes. But I think it would be a great idea to experiment with this and try it out and see.
Lauren Lipner writes, "Thank you, Catherine. Happy to join this meeting. In working to train a graduate student group in using the FreeRS, I am finding that coding significance codes to be the most difficult in terms of reliability, even more so than the markers themselves. Do you have any tips for training students on these specifically?"
Not really, and I acknowledge that that is a limitation and something we need to work on more. I think it would probably be about sort of practicing and just getting everybody sort of thinking about it the same way. It might be helpful to identify some examples that are really high and some examples that are really low, so you could sort of get a sense of, okay, this is what a 1 is like, and this is what a 5 is like. And once we know that, we can sort of try to gauge some in the middle. But I also acknowledge that I think, like I mentioned earlier, one of the problems is right now our anchors for that are kind of vague. So that is something that we're trying to work on ourselves.
So, Catherine, as for now, I believe we don't have any further questions, and we are in perfect timing, actually, to
Wow.
start wrapping up. So let me just give a final note and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think I speak for everyone when I say that it's such a cool research program, and we really benefit a lot from this very cool introduction you gave us today.
Thank you.
And this webinar, I want everyone to know that this webinar was recorded, and so you will be able to access it soon on both the CEPI and the SPR Vimeo accounts. And we hope that we will hold the next webinar soon, and you will also be informed of that. So one last silent and very warm thank you to Catherine.
Thank you, everybody. It was really a great privilege to do this.